The Thanksgiving lantern keeper begins on a night when memory feels warmer than fire, and silence carries the weight of forgotten names. And tonight, dear listener, you are listening to a bedtime story, a sleep story, a relaxing story woven like a guided sleep meditation, told softly by me, Evelyn Blackwood, from Midnight Murmurs Radio. As the last autumn leaves cling to bare branches and the air smells faintly of smoke, apples, and old wood waiting to be burned. Before the story fully opens, allow yourself to settle where you are now, lying back comfortably, letting your shoulders sink, your jaw loosen, your hands rest without effort. And as you breathe in slowly through your nose, imagine the breath is warm and amber-colored, like lantern light. And as you accept, feel the long day drift away from you, every worry softening, every sharp edge smoothing until you are safe, quiet, and ready to wander somewhere else. With your eyes gently closed, picture a road at dusk in rural New England, sometime in the early 20th century, where Thanksgiving is less a feast and more a ritual of survival, gratitude stitched together with grief, and where small towns remember longer than they forgive. The road curves toward a village nestled between dark pines and low hills, its houses huddled together as if sharing secrets. And at the edge of the common stands an old iron lantern post, taller than a man, its glass panes clouded with age, glowing every evening without fail. No one remembers who first lit it, only that it has never gone dark, not even during storms, blackouts, or the long winters when the river froze solid and the dead were buried beneath snow too hard to break. They call it the Thanksgiving lantern, and they say it is kept by a man who does not seem to age, a quiet figure who appears each year as the holiday approaches, wrapped in a wool coat the color of ash, moving through the village just after sunset, checking doors, mending broken steps, leaving baskets of bread or dried corn on porches where hunger once lived. His name, if he has one, is spoken softly, if at all, because names here have a way of lingering too long, and memory in this town is not always kind. As you drift deeper into the story, imagine the sound of your breath blending with the distant creak of tree branches and the faint hum of wind. And notice how calm settles in your chest, even as something colder brushes the edges of the scene. Long ago, before electric light softened the dark, this village learned to fear nights without guidance, nights when people wandered and did not return, when grief hollowed homes and Thanksgiving tables were set for ghosts as much as for the living. It was during one such winter, heavy with loss and unspoken blame, that the lantern first appeared, lit on the eve of Thanksgiving by a man whose family had vanished in a fire that left no body, only scorched earth and questions the town refused to answer. He did not accuse, did not beg, did not leave. He only lit the lantern and stayed, night after night, year after year, as if tending the light could keep memory from turning cruel. Now, as the present draws closer, you can sense the village preparing once again. Shutters closing early, kitchens filling with the low murmur of cooking, and beneath it all, the quiet understanding that the lantern will soon ask something in return, not in words, but in remembrance. Let the images move slowly, like a dream you do not need to control. the glow of the lantern reflecting on frost, the keeper's shadow stretching long across the ground, his footsteps soundless, his presence both comforting and unsettling. And as this first part of the story gently settles around you, allow yourself to feel held by the rhythm of it, knowing there is no rush, no demand, only the soft unfolding of a tale meant to carry you safely toward rest. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The lantern's glow seems to breathe as the night deepens, and as you continue resting there, wrapped in quiet and shadow, the village begins to reveal what it never says aloud. Because memory here is not stored in books or photographs, but in habits, glances, and the careful way people avoid certain streets after dusk. The Thanksgiving lantern keeper moves slowly along the narrow path beside the common, his boots leaving no sound. His presence felt more than seen, and as you imagine him, allow your breath to remain slow and steady, each inhale like a soft knock at a door that will always open, each exhale a release into warmth and safety. The houses he passes lean slightly inward, their windows dim, curtains drawn, yet behind the glass, families gather around tables worn smooth by generations, plates steaming gently, voices lowered whenever the lantern's light slides across the walls, because everyone knows that when the keeper walks, the past walks with him. Long ago, before the town learned how to smile again, there was a Thanksgiving marked by absence, when half the village stayed away from the common fire, when a whisper spread that someone must be blamed for the fire that took an entire household and left behind a man who did not scream, did not curse, but simply stayed. The keeper, they say, was once ordinary, a dock worker or mill hand, a man whose hands smelled of iron and pine sap, whose laughter had filled a kitchen now gone to ash. And on the night of the fire, the lantern post was dark, the village wrapped in careless shadow. As you sink deeper into the rhythm of the story, notice how the keeper paused at the edge of the old river bridge, lifting the lantern slightly, its light reflecting on black water below, and in that reflection, other shapes seem to gather, faint outlines like breath on glass, faces not quite forming, but present enough to be felt. These are not angry spirits, not wailing ghosts, but memories that never learned how to leave. Townsfolk who once crossed this bridge for the last time, children who ran ahead and never came back, women who waited through winters that stretched too long. And the lantern does not banish them, it gathers them, holding them close so they do not wander alone. The keeper continues on, stopping at a small, sagging house near the woods, where a single candle flickers inside, and though the door does not open, the light inside grows steadier, warmer, as if reassured by his passing. You may feel a gentle shiver at this moment, not of fear, but of recognition, the quiet understanding that this town survives by acknowledging what it lost, not by pretending it never hurt. The wind moves through bare branches, carrying with it the faint sound of a hymn once sung at Thanksgiving services when the church still stood whole, and the keeper tilts his head, listening, as though counting voices that no longer need mouths. Somewhere deeper in the village, a bell rings once, not struck by any hand, and the lantern flares softly in response, brighter but never harsh, like a heartbeat quickening and then settling again. As the night wears on, the keeper returns toward the common, and you sense that this walk is not just tradition, but duty, a promise made in the aftermath of tragedy, that no one would be left unguided again. Not the living, not the dead. Allow the images to slow further now, the glow softening, your own body growing heavier, more relaxed, as if the lantern's warmth has found you too, wherever you are resting. There is no urgency here, no demand to remember every detail, only the comfort of knowing that someone keeps watch, that light remains even when stories grow old and voices fade. And as this part of the tale gently settles into stillness, let your breathing deepen. Let your thoughts drift like leaves on dark water, and trust that the story will continue to unfold when you are ready. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The night seems to grow deeper rather than darker, as though the village is sinking gently into itself. And as you remain resting there, wrapped in the slow cadence of breath and memory, the lantern's presence begins to feel less like an object and more like a listening ear, attentive to every unspoken thought that drifts through the cold air. The Thanksgiving lantern keeper pauses near the old meeting hall. Its windows boarded, its steps worn hollow by decades of boots and bare feet, and in the lantern's glow, faint marks appear on the wood, scratches and carvings left by hands long gone, names half erased, dates that end too soon. All of them softly illuminated as if being acknowledged at last. Let your shoulders sink a little further. Your breath moving is because nothing here asks you to act or decide, only to witness. To float alongside the keeper as he carries his light through spaces where time has thinned. Long before the fire that changed him, this hall held Thanksgiving gatherings that stretched late into the night, with laughter echoing off the rafters and stories traded like warm bread. But it also held meetings where blame was weighed and judgments passed, where fear quietly chose its targets. And when the fire came, there were those who wondered if the lantern's absence had been a choice rather than an accident. The keeper lifts the lantern higher, and for a moment, the glow reveals shapes inside the hall. Chairs arranged in careful rows, shadows seated as if waiting, their edges soft, patient, and as the light touches them, a low murmur rises, not voices, but the sensation of being remembered. You may feel a subtle tightening in your chest that quickly loosens again, because this is not a place of punishment, but of unresolved belonging. Outside, snow begins to fall, slow and deliberate, each flake catching the lantern light before disappearing, and the keeper steps back, allowing the hall to return to quiet, its secrets held but not forgotten. He continues down a narrow lane where the houses are older, closer together, and as he passes, you notice that some doors open just a fraction, not enough to be seen, but enough to let the light slip inside, touching empty chairs at tables where someone once sat, warming spaces where silence has grown too comfortable. This is how the lantern works, not by chasing away darkness, but by softening it, making room for what lingers. The keeper stops at the edge of the cemetery, a modest place marked by stones worn smooth, names barely legible, and as he stands there, the lantern's glow spreads wider than before, revealing paths between the graves that do not exist in daylight. Shapes move along these paths, slow and unhurried, pausing as the light passes, and you understand, without fear, that these are the ones who follow him each year, drawn not by obligation, but by the promise of warmth and direction. The keeper does not look at them directly, but you sense his awareness, his careful count, ensuring none are missing, because once, long ago, someone was left behind, and the cost of that mistake still hums beneath the town like a low wire. As the lantern dips and steadies, the snow thickens, muffling all sound, and the village seems to hold its breath, waiting for something unnamed to be completed. Let your own breathing mirror this hush, slow and deep, as if you too are part of the procession, guided but unburdened. Moving toward a place where rest is allowed, the keeper turns back toward the common, the lantern's light trailing behind him like a memory that refuses to be rushed. And as the scene softens around you, notice how your thoughts drift more freely, unhooked from urgency, carried by the steady rhythm of the walk. There is still more to be revealed, still a choice made long ago that has not yet been spoken aloud. But for now, the night wraps itself gently around the village, and the lantern continues to glow, patient and enduring. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The lantern's light grows softer as the night stretches on, and the village, now hushed beneath falling snow, begins to feel less like a place on a map and more like a memory slowly replaying itself. And as you rest there, breathing evenly, you may sense how the story leans closer, not to frighten, but to confess. The Thanksgiving lantern keeper walks toward the old mill at the edge of town. Its great wheel long stilled, its beams warped by damp years and regret, and as the lantern illuminates the doorway, the air itself seems to thicken, carrying the echo of a night when voices were raised and choices were made too quickly, long before the fire, before the lantern became a promise. The mill was where the town argued about survival, about scarcity and blame, about whose loss mattered most. And on that fateful Thanksgiving Eve, when the snow came early and supplies ran thin, a decision was reached in whispers to bar certain families from the common fire to protect what little warmth remained. The keeper, then still a man among men, stood silent as the vote passed, his hesitation mistaken for agreement, and when the excluded homes burned later that night, whether by accident or neglect, no one ever proved. The town learned how heavy silence could be. As you imagine the keeper standing now before the mill, lantern trembling slightly in his grasp, allow your own breath to slow further, because this is where the weight of the story rests, not in terror, but in consequence. The lantern's glow spills inside, and for a moment, the mill seems to move again, shadows turning like gears, figures gathered in argument, their faces blurred, their words reduced to a low, constant hum. And among them stands the keeper's younger self, watching, listening, choosing not to speak. The present keeper closes his eyes, and the lantern brightens, as if responding to the memory, and the shadows soften, no longer accusing, only waiting. Outside, the snow deepens, covering tracks old and new, and the village feels suspended between what was and what might have been, held there by the steady light. The keeper steps back, leaving the mill to its quiet, and continues toward a small clearing where the remains of the burned homes lie beneath layers of frost and time. Here, the lantern's light grows wider, and you sense the gathered presence of those lost that night, not reaching out, not demanding, only present, as if asking to be seen without judgment. The keeper sets the lantern down in the snow, kneeling beside it, and for the first time, the village seems to exhale, a collective release carried on the wind. In this moment you may feel a gentle ache, quickly soothed, because the story is not asking you to relive regret, only to acknowledge how Isaliham can grow from quiet choices. The lantern's flame steadies, and the shapes around the clearing begin to fade, not vanishing, but settling, as though the act of remembrance has given them rest. The keeper rises, lifting the lantern once more, and the path back to the common appears clearer, less burdened, and as he walks, the snow reflects the light in countless small sparks, turning the night into something almost beautiful. Let your body grow heavier now, your thoughts slowing, because this part of the tale has given what it needed to give, and the story will not rush you further tonight. As the lantern's glow recedes into the distance, the village returns to quiet, changed in ways that will only be felt with time. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The night no longer feels endless now, but full, as if it has reached the quiet middle of a long-held breath. And as you remain drifting there, calm and the lantern's glow begins to change in a way only those who have lived with it long enough can sense. The Thanksgiving lantern keeper moves more slowly, his steps measured, deliberate, because this is the hour when the lantern remembers more than it reveals, when the past presses close not with accusation, but with expectation. Snow lies deep across the common, smoothing the ground where fires were once built and rebuilt, and in the center stands the lantern post, waiting, its iron darkened by years of touch and weather. The keeper approaches it with care, lifting the lantern higher than before, and for a moment the light flares, casting long shadows that stretch outward like paths, branching into many possible nights. As you breathe gently, imagine those shadows carrying scenes within them, Thanksgivings layered atop one another, tables crowded and then sparse, laughter fading into silence, hands clasped in gratitude and later folded in grief. All of it moving slowly, as though unwilling to disturb your rest. The keeper pauses, and you sense his hesitation, because this is the place where the lantern's purpose must be renewed each year, not by ritual alone, but by choice. Long ago, after the fire and the quiet that followed, the village agreed without speaking that the lantern would stand as witness, not judge. But no one ever asked who would tend it when the keeper could no longer walk the paths, who would bear the weight of remembering on behalf of others. The lantern's light dims slightly, and you may feel a soft heightening in the air. Not fear, but the gravity of an ending approaching. The keeper rests a gloved hand against the iron post, and the glow steadies, revealing faint marks along the metal, fingerprints layered so thick they seem etched, each one belonging to someone who once relied on this light to find their way home. From the edge of the common, a figure watches, half hidden by snow-laden trees, someone younger, uncertain, drawn by the lantern's warmth without fully understanding why. The keeper notices, though he does not turn, and the lantern's glow stretches subtly in that direction, like an invitation extended without pressure. This is how the lantern has always chosen, not through command, but through quiet recognition. And as the figure steps closer, you sense a shift, a gentle passing of something unseen. The keeper lifts the lantern once more, holding it between himself and the iron post, and the light flows, not spilling, not flickering, but easing into place, as if settling into a familiar home. Around the common, the village seems to lean inward, houses listening, trees bending slightly, the snow itself holding still. And in this suspended moment, the weight the keeper has carried for so long begins to lighten. You may feel that easing, too, a soft release in your chest, because the story is moving toward rest. Not resolution yet, but reassurance. The younger figure steps back, understanding not yet complete, but planted, and the keeper lowers the lantern, its glow now gentler, steadier, less burdened by regret. He stands quietly for a long moment, allowing the night to accept the change, and then turns toward the path that leads away from the common, his steps lighter than before. Let your own thoughts drift now, unhooked from the need to follow every detail, trusting that the light knows where it is going. As the lantern's glow settles into its place, the village breathes easier, and the night resumes its slow, protective rhythm. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The night begins to loosen its grip, not by brightening, but by softening, as though it understands that something has been set gently back into balance. And as you remain resting there, calm and unburdened, the village feels different now, quieter in a way that invites rest rather than vigilance. The Thanksgiving lantern keeper walks the final stretch of his familiar path, away from the common and toward the edge of town where the road thins and the trees grow closer together, their branches arching overhead like a sheltering roof. The lantern's glow no longer pulls at the shadows as it once did. Instead, it settles among them, a companion rather than a guide. And you may sense how the weight he carried for so long has begun to lift, not vanishing, but transforming into something lighter, something shared. Behind him, the iron post stands steady, holding the light without strain, and the younger presence near the common remains still, watching, absorbing, not yet acting, but already listening. This is how transitions happen here, quietly, without ceremony, without witnesses who would interrupt the moment with questions. The keeper pauses at the edge of the woods, where the path dissolves into snow and memory, and he turns once more, not to look at the lantern, but to feel it, the way one feels warmth through a wall, certain of its presence without needing proof. Long ago, he believed that staying was his only penance, that tending the light might somehow undo what silence allowed. But now, standing between the village and the forest, he understands that remembrance is not meant to imprison, only to illuminate. The wind moves softly through the trees, carrying with it the distant clink of dishes being set, the low murmur of Thanksgiving prayers spoken with renewed ease, and the keeper allows himself a long, steady breath. the kind that comes only when duty loosens into trust. As he steps into the woods, the lantern's glow does not follow, and for the first time, that absence feels right, intentional, like setting down a burden after a long journey. The forest accepts him without resistance, snow cushioning each step, darkness folding around him not as threat, but as rest. And soon there is no sign of where he went, only the sense that something has completed its circle. Back in the village, the night resumes its gentle rhythm, houses warm, paths clear, memories acknowledged rather than avoided, and the lantern stands quietly, glowing for whoever may need it next. Allow your own body to mirror this easing, your breathing slow and deep, your thoughts drifting without effort, because this chapter of the story has done what it came to do. There is nothing left for you to hold on to here. Nothing unresolved that needs your attention, only the soft assurance that light can be tended without being owned, that memory can be honored without being feared. As the last images settle, the snow continues to fall, steady and forgiving, covering old tracks and new alike, and the village rests beneath it, whole in its quiet way. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep, knowing that you are safe, guided, and free to let go. And if you find comfort in these whispered journeys through memory and shadow, I invite you, gently and without urgency, to support Midnight Murmurs Radio by subscribing, by returning when nights feel long, and by allowing these stories to accompany you again whenever you need rest. Your presence here keeps the lantern lit, not by obligation, but by choice. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The season turns without asking permission, and the village feels it first in the quiet places, in the way the air thins after Thanksgiving, in the softer echo of footsteps across the common, in the lantern's glow, settling into a steadier, watchful calm. As you remain resting there, breathing slow and easy, imagine the days passing gently, leaves fully fallen now, snow arriving not as spectacle but as routine, and the lantern standing faithful through it all, no longer carried, yet never alone. The younger figure who once lingered at the edge of the light returns on a morning just before winter truly claims the town, drawn not by duty, but by a pull that feels older than words. They approach the iron post with care, feeling the warmth through their gloves, noticing how the glow responds, not brighter, not dimmer, but attentive, as if recognizing a familiar rhythm. The village watches, without watching, doors closed, but hearts slightly open, because everyone senses that a threshold has been crossed, and thresholds here are respected. Long after the keeper's departure into the woods, small changes begin to surface. A broken step mended before anyone asks. A meal left quietly on a porch that had not known hunger yet somehow needed comfort. And the lantern's light seems to linger a moment longer on certain paths, suggesting where it might be useful next. As you drift deeper into the story, let your shoulders soften further, because this chapter does not rush toward revelation. It settles into listening. The new caretaker does not announce themselves, does not claim the role, but they begin to walk the village at dusk, hands empty, eyes observant, learning where the light falls naturally and where it hesitates, where memory presses close And where it has grown thin, the old meeting hall feels quieter now, its shadows seated but less restless. And when the lantern's glow brushes its boards, the hum inside lowers to a patient murmur. At the cemetery, paths still appear between stones, but fewer shapes gather, and those that do seem calmer, lingering only long enough to be acknowledged before drifting back into rest. The river reflects the light cleanly, without faces rising to meet it, and the bridge creaks as it always has, a sound no longer heavy with warning. You may sense a subtle warmth spreading through the scene. Not bright, not celebratory, but steady, like coals that no longer need tending every moment. Yet beneath this calm, something waits, a story not yet spoken, tied not to fire or blame, but to what happens when memory is allowed to soften too much. As winter deepens, the lantern begins to reveal new paths, ones that lead beyond the village into the surrounding woods, where older histories lie buried beneath roots and snow. Stories predating the town itself, carried here by settlers who believed they were arriving first. The caretaker feels this pull most strongly near the solstice, when nights stretch longest and the lantern's glow seems to reach farther than before. Brushing tree trunks etched with symbols, Coziest Bedtime, stones arranged in patterns no one in the village remembers making. The air there feels different, not threatening, but watchful, as if the land itself is waiting to be acknowledged again. Let your breathing remain slow and even, because this awareness does not demand action, yet only attention. Back in the village, small traditions shift. A chair left empty at the Thanksgiving table is now set intentionally, not for loss, but for listening. And people speak more softly of the past, not out of fear, but respect. The lantern stands at the center of it all, unchanged in form, yet subtly altered in purpose. No longer only guarding against what was lost, but illuminating what has been overlooked. As this first part of the new chapter settles around you, allow the images to blur at the edges, trusting that clarity will come when it is needed. The night remains gentle, protective, and the lantern's glow steady, patient, and alive with quiet intent. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The lantern's glow stretches farther into the winter nights now, not brighter, but more deliberate, as though it has learned where it wishes to linger. And as you remain drifting in that gentle space between waking and sleep, the world beyond the village begins to take shape in softer detail. The caretaker follows the pull one evening just after dusk, stepping beyond the last familiar fence, past the place where the road narrows and the trees stand closer together, their trunks dark and patient beneath layers of snow. The lantern does not sway in their hand, it steadies, illuminating a path that feels less like a trail and more like an invitation long deferred. As you breathe slowly, imagine the quiet of this place, the snow-absorbing sound, the air carrying the faint scent of pine and cold earth, and beneath it all, a sense of presence that predates houses, fences, and names. Long before the village was built, these woods were already marked, not by ownership, but by memory. And as the lantern's light brushes against stones half buried beneath snow, faint carvings emerge, circles and lines worn smooth by time, symbols of gathering and passage rather than warning. The caretaker pauses, feeling the warmth of the lantern deepen. And for a moment, the forest seems to respond. Branches creaking softly, snow shifting as if settling more comfortably. These are not restless spirits, but remnants of intention. Traces of people who once moved through these woods with reverence, whose rituals were quiet and cyclical, tied to seasons rather than fear. The lantern does not disrupt them, it recognizes them, and in doing so, something unseen eases as the caretaker moves deeper. The light reveals an old clearing, its shape too deliberate to be natural. Stones arranged in a wide ring, each one catching the glow in turn, and you may feel a subtle tightening that loosens again, because this place does not threaten, it remembers. The caretaker steps into the circle, and the lantern's glow spreads outward, touching each stone gently, and in response, the air hums faintly, not with voices, but with rhythm, like breath held and released over centuries. You sense that the lantern is not here to claim or correct, but to acknowledge a history the village never learned to name. Snow continues to fall beyond the circle, but inside, the ground feels warmer, softer, as if insulated by attention. The caretaker kneels briefly, setting the lantern at the center. And for a moment, the light seems to rise, not in flame, but in memory, revealing figures not as forms, but as smoky hands lifting, heads bowed, a shared stillness that once guided people through long winters without asking for dominance. The lantern does not absorb this. It reflects it. And in doing so, its purpose shifts again, expanding without losing what it has carried before. Back in the village, though no one knows where the caretaker has gone, something changes subtly. Dreams grow deeper, less troubled, and those who wake in the night feel less alone, as if the dark has learned how to hold without pressing. The caretaker rises, lifting the lantern once more, and the clearing settles. Stones returning to quiet, the forest accepting the light's presence without clinging to it. As you imagine the path back, notice how the lantern now illuminates not just what lies ahead, but what lies alongside, roots and branches made visible enough to be avoided, enough to move through safely. This is not a conquest of darkness, but cooperation, and the night seems to approve. As the caretaker returns toward the village, the lantern's glow follows more slowly, lingering a moment in the woods before rejoining its bearer, as if reluctant to leave, yet satisfied to have been seen. Let your thoughts soften now, because this part of the story has widened the world without unsettling it. And rest comes easier when understanding grows quietly. As the lantern's warmth settles again at the village edge, the forest remains calm, holding its memories without unrest. And the night resumes its steady rhythm. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The balance the lantern has begun to weave feels gentle but incomplete, like a song missing its final note. And as you remain resting in that calm, half-dreaming space, the night itself seems to lean closer, listening for what has yet to be spoken. The caretaker senses it first in the village, not as fear, but as a subtle resistance, a place where the lantern's glow hesitates, dimming just enough to suggest uncertainty. Near the oldest house on the hill, a structure built before records were kept carefully, the light falters, revealing walls thick with silence and a door that has not been opened at night in many years. As you breathe slowly, imagine the caretaker standing there, lantern steady in hand, feeling the weight of something withheld, a memory pressed flat and hidden rather than acknowledged. This house belonged to one of the town's earliest families, settlers who survived their first winters by learning quickly what the land required, yet who left behind journals that ended abruptly, their final pages torn away. The lantern's glow slips through the windows, illuminating an empty chair placed deliberately facing the door, a place kept for someone who never returned, and the air inside carries the heaviness of words unsaid. The caretaker does not enter, understanding that some thresholds must be approached gradually, but the lantern's light lingers, warm in the walls just enough to stir what has long been quiet. Beyond the house, the path leads back toward the woods, and as the caretaker follows it, the forest responds differently than before, branches bending lower, shadows gathering closer together, not hostile, but expectant. In a narrow ravine where snow collects deeply and sound seems to disappear, the lantern reveals markings unlike those in the clearing. Sharper, more insistent, carved into stone with urgency rather than reverence. These marks speak of interruption, of rituals cut short, of agreements broken when survival hardened into control. The caretaker feels a tightening in the chest that eases only slightly, because this memory does not belong to one place alone. It stretches between the village and the woods, binding them in an unspoken tension. As the lantern's light moves across the carvings, faint echoes rise, not voices, but impressions, the feeling of being pushed aside, of being silenced in the name of order. The lantern does not recoil, but its glow deepens, absorbing nothing, reflecting everything, and in doing so, it reveals the truth the village has avoided, that its peace was built not only on remembrance, but on omission. Back in the village, the effect is immediate but quiet. Dreams shift again, no longer only restful, but vivid. People waking with the sense that they have forgotten something important, something that wants to be named. The caretaker kneels in the ravine, setting the lantern carefully on the snow, and for a moment the light spreads unevenly, flickering against the stone before steadying, as if deciding how much to reveal at once. You may feel a gentle stirring within yourself, not alarm, but recognition, because this story mirrors a familiar truth, that calm built without honesty eventually asks to be The caretaker rises slowly, understanding now that the lantern's next task is not to soothe, but to witness a memory the town never allowed itself to carry. As they turn back toward the village, the lantern's glow follows more cautiously, its warmth intact but tempered by awareness, and the night seems to hold its breath again, waiting. Let your own breathing remain deep and unforced, because this part of the tale does not demand resolution yet, only patience. The village lights remain low, the forest still, and somewhere between them, a story waits to be told in full. As the lantern's glow settles once more at the common, the sense of anticipation lingers, soft but undeniable, and the night wraps itself around the village, protective but alert. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The night does not grow louder as the hidden memory begins to stir. it grows quieter, as though every surface in the village has learned to listen at once. And as you remain drifting there, safely wrapped in the slow rhythm of breath and shadow, the lantern's glow begins to change in texture rather than strength, softer at the edges, deeper at its center. The caretaker feels this shift while standing at the common, noticing how the light no longer spreads evenly, but gathers itself, lingering where the ground dips slightly, where an old well once stood before being filled and forgotten. Snow settles gently over the place, disguising it as ordinary ground. Yet the lantern insists, warming that patch just enough for the snow to sink and reveal a faint circle beneath. Long ago, before the fire, before the mill arguments, before the town learned how to stay quiet about its compromises, this well had been a meeting place, not for settlers alone, but for those who moved through the land before names were written down. And when fear crept in and alliances shifted, it was sealed rather than honored. The caretaker kneels, lantern close to the ground, and the glow seeps downward, illuminating stonework still intact, markings matching those in the forest ravine. Now dulled, but unmistakable. As you breathe slowly, imagine the sensation of something long denied, finally being acknowledged, not with urgency, but with care. The lantern's light does not pry. It invites, and from the depth of the well rises not a voice, but a feeling, the memory of gatherings held in trust, of stories shared without ownership, of guidance given freely and then taken away. Around the common, houses seem to lean inward, walls creaking softly, as if remembering their own foundations. And within them, people stir in their sleep, dreaming of hands passing bowls, of fires shared without fences, of agreements that did not require silence to survive. The caretaker remains still, allowing the lantern to hold the moment without shaping it. And slowly, the glow reveals not blame, but consequence. The way sealing the well redirected the village's path, how fear of losing control hardened into tradition, and tradition into omission. The lantern brightens slightly, enough to show the well's stone settling, not collapsing, but resting, as if relieved to be seen again. In the woods beyond, the forest responds with a soft release, branches lifting, shadows loosening, and the old clearing warms, its stones catching a light they have waited generations to feel. The caretaker rises, understanding now that the lantern's task is not to reopen what was closed, but to remember it honestly, to let the village carry the full shape of its past rather than a polished fragment. Snow begins to fall again, thicker now, yet the lantern's glow keeps the well visible just long enough to be known, then allows it to fade gently back beneath the white. This is not forgetting, but integration, and you may feel a corresponding ease in your own body, a softening that comes when truth is allowed to exist without demand. The caretaker steps back, lantern steady, and the common feels wider, less boarded as though space has been returned to it. As the night continues, the village settles into a deeper calm, one that does not depend on silence, but on acknowledgement, and the lantern stands at its center, unchanged in form, yet unmistakably fuller. Let your thoughts drift now, unhooked from the need to resolve or judge, trusting that the story knows how to move at the pace of rest. As the glow steadies and the snow smooths the ground once more, the village breathes together, and the night holds. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The village does not wake suddenly to what has been remembered. It eases into it, like a body turning in sleep without fully rising. And as you remain resting there, breath slow and the lantern's glow begins to ripple outward in small, nearly invisible ways. People notice it first in ordinary moments. A pause before speaking, a gentler hand placed on a door frame, a sense of space returning where tension once lived unnoticed. The caretaker walks the familiar paths again, lantern held low, and finds that certain places no longer pull at the light, while others, newly revealed, ask quietly for attention. Near the river, where settlers once redirected water without understanding its rhythms, the lantern lingers, illuminating stones shifted out of place, and the current responds by smoothing itself, flowing with less resistance. In Tekich of the village, meals are prepared with fewer words but more presence. Recipes altered slightly, not for novelty, but instinctively, as though hands remember proportions that were once shared and then forgotten. As you breathe in slowly, imagine that sense of gentle correction, not dramatic, not demanding, simply allowing what was misaligned to settle closer to balance. The caretaker senses a choice forming, not imposed by the lantern, but suhis by its steadiness, a choice about whether the village will continue to let the light work quietly in the background, or whether it will acknowledge, together, what it has learned to carry. At the common, a small gathering forms one evening, not announced, not planned, just a few figures standing within the lantern's reach, drawn by a shared, unspoken understanding. They do not speak at first. They stand, listening to the snow fall, to the distant creak of trees, to the soft hum that now seems to live within the light itself. When words come, they are simple, fragments of stories once set aside, not accusations, but admissions, spoken without urgency, received without defense. The lantern does not brighten. It steadies, and in that steadiness, the caretaker feels the weight of the role shift again, becoming less solitary, more shared. In the woods, the clearing responds with warmth, its stones catching the light even from a distance, and the ravines, sharper markings, dull further, no longer needing to insist on being seen. The caretaker walks beyond the common later that night, lantern swinging gently, and finds that paths once hidden now reveal themselves naturally, not glowing, just visible enough to be chosen. You may feel your own body responding to this rhythm, muscles loosening, thoughts drifting without pulling you back, because the story is nearing a place of rest rather than climax. The caretaker pauses at the edge of the forest, understanding that the lantern's work is changing once more, becoming less about guiding through darkness and more about reminding those who walk that the ground beneath them holds more than one story. Snow continues to fall, covering footprints without erasing the paths themselves, and the village feels held rather than watched. As the lantern's glow settles back into its familiar place, there is no sense of loss, only the quiet assurance that memory, once acknowledged, does not need to demand attention to remain alive. Let your breathing deepen now, slow and ebb in, because this part of the tale has softened what needed softening, and the final movement of the chapter will come gently, without disturbance. As the night carries the village toward rest, the lantern remains patient and warm, no longer burdened by what it alone must remember. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The night settles into its deepest quiet, not because everything has been resolved, but because everything that needed to be acknowledged has finally been allowed to rest. And as you remain drifting there, safe and the lantern's glow feels less like a presence and more like a shared breath moving through the village. Snow continues to fall, gentle and unremarkable, smoothing the common, softening rooftops, easing the edges of paths that no longer feel uncertain. The caretaker stands beneath the iron post one last time this season, not to mark an ending, but to recognize a steadiness that no longer depends on constant tending. The lantern glows evenly now, its light no longer pulling at buried places or lingering over withheld memories, because those stories have been folded back into the land, into the people, into the rhythm of days that will continue without spectacle. Around the common houses rest with an ease they have not known in generations. Walls holding warmth without tension, doors closed but not guarded, and inside, people sleep more deeply. Dreams quiet and spacious, free of the sharp edges that once woke them without explanation. The caretaker does not feel watched as before, but accompanied, aware that the lantern's work has become something shared, something that lives in small choices rather than singular acts. In the woods beyond the village, the clearing lies calm beneath snow. Stones content to remain stones, their purpose fulfilled not by ritual, but by remembrance carried forward honestly. The ravine holds its silence without insistence, and the old well beneath the common rests, unseen but no longer forgotten, its presence acknowledged in the way people gather now, leaving space rather than filling it with certainty. The caretaker steps away from the lantern, not disappearing, not relinquishing, simply trusting. And that trust feels complete. As you imagine this final image, allow your own body to soften further, your breath slow and deep, because the story has reached the place where nothing more needs to happen. The lantern does not dim, but it does not call either. Content to remain a quiet constant rather than a guide. The village settles into winter fully now, days shortening, nights length, yet the darkness feels less heavy, less crowded with unspoken things. Somewhere, far from the common, a path opens naturally beneath falling snow, and someone walks it without fear, guided not by light alone, but by understanding. This is the gift the lantern has offered, not salvation, not absolution, but the gentle permission to remember without being consumed, to move forward without erasing what came before. Let that permission extend to you as well, here in this moment of rest where there is nothing you need to hold, nothing you need to resolve, only the quiet assurance that you are allowed to sleep. As the images blur and soften, the lantern's glow remains steady in the distance, no longer the focus, simply part of the night's natural order. The village breathes, the land rests, and the story completes its circle, returning you gently to stillness. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep.